Hello, welcome to Daf Yomi, Masechet Berakhot, chapter 3. We're on Daf Kaf Hey, Amud Aleph. We're going to start at Daf Kaf Dalet, Amud Bet, page 24, the second page, near the bottom. Tanya Kavated Rav Huna, Tanya Kavated Rav Chista, Tanya Kavated Rav Huna, Hamalech b'mavuot u'metunafot, maniach edu al piv, v'yikra kriyat Shema. So, according to Rav Chista, according to Rav Huna, somebody who walks through a filthy alley should put his hand over his mouth and continue to recite the Shema. Again, we're talking about a situation where someone's in where if it's time to say Shema, he must say the Shema at this time, and he is forced to be walking through or standing in or walking through a filthy alley, a place where there might be human excrement or other smelly things or smelly animal excrement. So according to Rav Huna, he says the Shema, but he keeps his mouth covered with his hand. Tanya Kavatet Rav Chista, Hayam Halech b'mavuot u'tunafot, Lo yikra kriyat Shema, v'lo od shelo ela she'im haya koreh uva posek. It was taught in a Braita in accordance with the opinion of Rav Chista, one who was walking in the filthy alleyways may not recite the Shema. Furthermore, if he was in the course of reciting the Shema, when he reached the filthy alleyway, he stops his recitation at that point. Lo pasak mai, the Gemara asks, if one did not stop, then what is his status? Amar Rebbe Miyasha bar Bred Rebbe Yehoshua ben Levi. Rebbe Miyasha, son of Rebbe Yehoshua ben Levi, said the following: Alav hakatuv omer, v'gam ani natati lahem chukim lo tovim u'mishpatim lo yichyu bahem. The grandson of Rebbe Yehoshua ben Levi, Rebbe Miyasha, said, moreover, I give them status that were not, moreover, I gave them statuses that were not good, and laws by which they could not live. That's from the 20th chapter of Ezekiel. As in the case following these statuses and laws led to sin, as in this case, the following the statuses and the laws led them to sin, not to mitzvah. So that's why this is one way of understanding the verse in Yechezkel. The verse in Yechezkel is used as a proof text. It's not purely in the context of Yechezkel, but the sages would take verses from the Torah writings and the prophets and the writings and use them to prove certain halachic issues or to derive halachot. But there are 70 faces to the Torah, so there may be very many other meanings and reasons why Ezekiel actually said this. But in this case, we're talking about walking through a filthy alleyway. So, Rabbi Miyasha, quoted Ezekiel again, V'gam ani natati lahem chukim lo tovim u'mishpatim lo yichyu bahem. Meaning to somebody who walks through the filthy alleyway and does not cease his recitation of the Shema due to the uncleanliness of the place, he's not following the law. It's as if he can't live by the law of the Torah based on Ezekiel. Now it's an interesting Rav Miyasha, son of Rabbi Yehoshua. You don't often find, it's very rare that you find the name of a Tana or an Amora who is his name is Bar Bre to Rav Yehoshua. How many Bar Bres are son of? I mean, you have Rabbi Bar Bachama. That's one example. But other than Bar Bachama, I can't think of one as Bar Bre. So there may very well be some others. Rabbi Steinsaltz writes that based on his age and the sages with whom he was associated, apparently Rabbi Miyasha was among the students of Rabbi Yochanan. However, he clearly learned most of his Torah from his grandfather, in whose name he often cites his teachings. Rabbi Miyasha did not live a long life, as he died during his grandfather's lifetime, after a protracted illness. It is precisely the fact that so young a scholar was privileged to have halachic statements cited in his name, both in the Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmuds, as well in Midrashic literature, that underscores his greatness. So that's Rabbi Miyashe, son of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. The Gemara continues. Rav Asi Amar, Hoi moshche ha'avon bechevle hashav. Woe to those who draw iniquity with cords of vanity. Rav Ada bar Ahava Amar Mahacha, ki devar Hashem baza. So Rav Ashi cited a verse from Isaiah chapter 5, meaning that this man brings sin upon himself for naught. Rav Ada bar Ahava said is derived from the verse in Numbers, for he has shown contempt for the word of the Lord. Meaning that uttering God's word, saying the Shema in a place of filth, shows contempt for God. The Gemara asks, Im pasak mascharo, if you've said, oh, it's a dirty place, I have to stop saying Shema, stop, or this could hold for if he happens to be reciting Tilim, or any words of holiness, words of Torah. What is his reward? Or perhaps it is just for Shema. We could discuss what it's talking about. Certainly it's talking about recitation of Shema. It may perhaps be discussing other matters of Kedusha that are being said that need to be stopped. So, the Impasak Mascharo. Amar Rabbi Abahu, alav hakatuv omer, uvadavar hazeh tarichu yamim. Rabbi Abahu said, of him the verse says, and through this matter you shall prolong your days. That's from the 32nd chapter of Deuteronomy, meaning that by being careful with one's speech, one merits longevity. Amar Rav Huna, hayta talito chagura lo al matnav mutar likra kriyat Shema. Rav Huna said, one whose garment was tied around his waist, even if he was bare above the waist, it is permitted for him to recite the Shema. Indeed, Tana nami hachi. That opinion was also taught in a Breita, which says, Hayta talito shel beged, v'shel or, v'shel sak, chagura al matnav, mutar likrot kriyat Shema. One whose garment was made of cloth, of leather, or of sack, or of any other material, and was strapped around his waist, he is permitted to recite the Shema. What is this garment made of cloth, leather, or sack? This list begins with an ordinary garment, shel beged. Beged is a generic term for any garment. Moves on to leather, or, which is also appropriate, and ends with sak, which is only barely constitutes suitable human clothing. Someone found a burlap sack in the trash or something. Didn't have the clothes to wear. It's barely considered suitable human clothing, in which, nevertheless, one is permitted to recite the Shema. So if a person is covered enough in any manner of garment, he is permitted to recite the Shema. That's the words of the Aderet Eliyahu. The Gemara continues. This is on Daf Chafei Amud Aleph. Aval letfilah ad shechaseh et libo. However, for prayer, one may not recite the silent standing prayer until he covers his heart, because in prayer he addresses God directly and he must act accordingly. So in the previous case, somebody has a garment or leather or sack and is tied around his waist, and he's bare-chested, he can say the Shema according to the letter of the law. this is not true for prayer. One may not recite the prayer until he covers his heart. He has to have his chest covered. V'amar Rav Huna, shachach nichnas v'tfilin lebet hakisei, maniach yado alehen ad shigmor sal kedatach. Rav Huna said, one who forgets to enter the bathroom while wearing phylacteries, places his hand on them until he finishes. The Gemara wonders, does it enter your mind that he can do so until he finishes? Ele kidamar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak ad sheyigmor amud rishon v'lifsok la'alter v'likum. Rather, as Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, until he finishes discharging his first mass of feces, at which point he can step out and remove his phylacteries. He walked into the bathroom. He forgot he was wearing his tefillin. He sat down to relieve himself, to defecate. Then what he remembers immediately that he has his tefillin on. The first of Rav Huna said that he should just put his hand on and cover his tefillin on his head until he finishes his business. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, no, until he finishes the first mass, the first discharge, and then he has to get up and he remove his tefillin, and then he can go back and finish his business. The Gemara asks, "V'lifsok la'altar v'likum." Let him stop immediately when he realizes that he is wearing phylacteries. Stand and step out. Mishum Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Detanya Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Amud HaChozer mevi et adam lidei hidrokan. Silon HaChozer mevi et adam lidei yerokan. The Gemara replies he cannot do so because he can't just stop. He can't finish his business and then leave. He can't stop immediately. Why does he get to finish the first mass? The first mass of feces, he can let it evacuate from his body. Why shouldn't he stop right away in the middle? Stand up and step out. The Gemara says he shouldn't stop in the middle because of what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said. As it was taught in the Braita, a mass of feces that is held back without having discharged causes a person to suffer from dropsy. The Gemara calls it hidrokan, while a stream of urine that is held back causes a person to suffer from jaundice, yerakon. Since there is a potential danger, the sages did not require him to step out and leave the room. So these diseases are not discussed here. They're perhaps discussed in another place. Itmar tsoa al basaro o yado munachat bebeit hakisei. Rav Huna amar mutar likrot kriyat shema. Rav Chisda amar asur likrot kriyat shema. Amar Rava, my Talmud Rav Huna, diktiv, kol aneshama telel ya, hallelujah. It was stated that the sages disagreed with regard to one had fecal matter on his skin, or on his hands, but not the rest of his body. And the person, if let's say he had fecal matter on his skin or his hands, but not the rest of his body, was placed inside the bathroom. Under those circumstances, Rav Huna said, he is permitted to recite Shema. Rav Chisda said he is prohibited from reciting Shema. Rava said, what is the reason for Rav Huna's position that he is permitted to say the Shema? As it is written, let every soul praise the Lord, hallelujah, from Psalm 150, which he interprets as let everything that has breath, a neshama, as long as the mouth with which he breathes, with which he recites praise, is in a place of purity outside the bathroom, as long as his mouth is in a place of purity, or the location of other limbs, the location of his other limbs are irrelevant. So you might even say, according to this, perhaps if he just had his head outside the bathroom, he could be saying Shema. Rav Chisda Amar Asur likrot Kriyat Shema. In such a case, Rav Chisda said, no, you are not permitted to say Kriyat Shema if you have your hand, just your hand in the bathroom, or if you have fecal matter on your skin somewhere. Relief from below is a sign of relief from above. If you saw the previous class, you know what I'm talking about. Rav Chisda said it's prohibited from saying Shema. What is the reason for Rav Chisda's opinion? My time with Rav Chisda? Diktiv. Kol atzmotai tomarna. Hashem mi chamocha. Rav Chisda said it's based on the verse in Psalms number 35. All of my bones shall say, who is like you, O Lord? Since the praise is undertaken, this praise is undertaken with one's entire body. When one praises God, he uses his entire body to serve God. All of his bones, all of his muscles, all of his strength. It's all used to serve God. Since this is the case, he may not recite the Shema, even if just one limb that is not appropriately clean. So, Kol atzmotai tomarna. If I'm just, my head is praying praise, but the rest of my body is in the bathroom, or even if my little finger is in the bathroom in an unclean place. The whole body as an organic whole has to be praising God, and the whole body has to be in a suitable status, a suitable state of cleanliness, in order to say the Shema and to pray. Itmar, Reach Rashish Loikar. Rav Huna Amar Marchik Arba Amot v'Korei Kriyat Shema. Rav Chisda Amar Marchik Arba Amot Mimakom Shepasak Hareach v'Korei Kriyat Shema. It was stated that the sages disagreed on a similar issue. What is the legal status of a foul odor that emanates from a visible source? Rav Huna said he distances himself 4 cubits from the source of the odor and recites the Shema. And Rav Chisda said the source is irrelevant. He distances himself 4 cubits from the place that the odor ceased and recites the Shema. Tanya Kaved Rav Chisda Lo Yikra Adam Kriyat Shema Lo Keneged Soat Adam Lo Keneged Soat Klevim Lo Keneged Soat Chazirim Lo Keneged Soat Tarnagolim Lo Keneged Soat Ashpa Shirechara. ואם היה מקום גבוה 10 טווחים או נמוך 10 טווחים יושב בצידו וקורא קריאת שמע ואם לאו מרחיק ממנו מלוא עיניו וכן לתפילה. The Gemara notes that it was taught in a Braita in accordance with the opinion of Rav Chisda. A person may not recite Shema opposite human excrement, dog excrement, pig excrement, chicken excrement, a foul-smelling dung heap, or anything repulsive. However, if the filth were in a place 10 handbreadths above or 10 handbreadths below him, he may sit alongside it and recite Shema. As a height disparity of 10 handbreadths, again 10 potatoes, above or below him, as a height disparity of 10 handbreadths renders a separate domain. And if the filth were not 10 handbreadths above or below him, he must distance himself until it remains beyond his range of vision. V'kein l'tfilah, reach rashi yesh lo ikar, marchik 4 amot mimakom hareach, v'korei kriyat shema. The same law holds true for prayer, for the Amidah. However, from a foul odor with a visible source, he distances himself 4 cubits from the place that the odor ceased and recites the Shema. Rava said, Amar Rava, Leitilchata ki had matnita b'kol hanishmaita ele ki ha detanya. Rava said the halacha is not in accordance with this Braita in all of these rulings, but rather in accordance with that which was taught in another Braita. Lo yikra adam kriyat shma lo keneged soat adam velo keneged soat chazirim velo keneged soat klavim bizman shenatan orot letochan. Bizman sheniten orot letochan. The other Braita says one may neither recite Shema opposite human excrement under all circumstances, nor opposite pig excrement, nor opposite dog excrement, into which skins have been placed for tanning, but other materials do not defile the venue of prayer. Ba'u minei merav sheshet. Ba'u minei merav sheshet. Reach ra she'en lo ikar mahu. What is the legal status of a foul odor that has no visible source? That is to say, flatulence. Amar lahu atu chazu hane tzife devei rav, v'hane ganu v'hane garsi, hane mile b'divrei Torah, aval b'kriyat shema lo. B'divrei Torah nami lo amran, ele lechavre, aval didei lo. He said to him, come and see these mats in the study hall. Tzife is Aramaic for mats. He said, come and see these mats in the study hall. As these students are sleeping on them, and these other students are studying, and they're not concerned about foul odors. Some of the students are sleeping, and in one's sleep one could pass gas, and the ones who are sitting and studying, they're not concerned, they're studying next to them. However, this only applies to Torah study, because there's no alternative. It happens. But not to the recitation of Shema. If there's a foul odor with the Shema, what's the law? One who seeks to recite Shema must distance himself 4 cubits from the source of a foul odor. If he is still able to smell the odor, he must distance himself until he can no longer smell the foul odor, in accordance with the opinion of Rav Chisda, which is supported by the Braita. That's the law from the Rambam, and based on the Ravid, who cites Rav Chai Gaon and disagrees with the Rambam. But that's the law. Itmar tsoa overet, Abaya mar mutar likrot kriyat shema, Rav amar asor likrot kriyat shema. It was stated that the sages discussed a parallel issue. What is the law regarding feces passing before him, being moved from place to place? You're on the street, it's time to say kriyat shema, you're traveling, all of a sudden this wagon comes by, and in the wagon there's an amount of feces on the wagon, and it smells, and it's going across in front of you. Abaya stated one is permitted. Abaya amar mutar likrot kriyat shema, Rav amar asor likrot kriyat shema. Abaya says it's permitted to recite the Shema if there's a feces passing before you, and Rava says it's forbidden to recite the kriyat shema if feces is passing before you. Amar Abaya mana aminala. D'tanan, ha-tameh omed tachat ha'Ilan v'ator over tameh, tahor omed tachat ha'Ilan v'tameh over tahor, v'im amad tameh, v'ken be'even ha'menugat. Abaya said, from where do I learn this halacha? I say this on the basis of what we learned in a Mishnah. One who is afflicted with biblical leprosy renders the area beneath any covering under which he is located ritually impure. In a case where the ritual impure leper is standing under the branches of a tree, and a ritually pure person passes under the branches of that same tree, the pure person is rendered impure, as the entire area under the covering of the branches, in this case the branches of the tree, is impure. However, if the pure person is standing under the tree, and the impure leper passes, he remains pure. And if the leper stopped under the tree, the pure person is immediately rendered impure. The same is true with regards to a stone afflicted with biblical leprosy, as we find mentioned in Leviticus chapter 14. In that case, he is merely being moved from place to place. In the case where the impurity is moving from place to place, it does not cause impurity. The upshot is that impurity is only disseminated in all directions when the source of the impurity is stationary. Rava Amar Lahem. So, in terms of ritual impurity passing, the laws concerning this type of ritual impurity are relevant to the impurity of the dead and the impurity of the leper as well. With regard to these impurities, in addition to being imparted by touch, it is also spread by means of a tent, that is to say, a corpse or a leper that is underneath an awning or a tent. The impurity fills that space. The related halachot are quite detailed in Tractate Oholot and elsewhere, and include the requirement that the impurity is stable. The source of the impurity is not standing. If the source of the impurity is not standing in one place, it does not impart the impurity of the tent, and as Rashi explains. V'rava Marlach. So that supports the position of Abaya, that Soa Overet, if there's feces passing before, then it's mutar to keep saying Shema. Rava said, no, it's forbidden, and this is how Rava explains his position. V'Rava amar lach hatam bikviyuta talya milta bikviyuta talya milta diktiv badad yeshev michutz lamachane moshevo badad yeshev michutz lamachane moshevo hacha v'haya machanecha kadosh amar Rachamana v'ha leka. And Rava could have said to you there, in the case of leprosy, it is contingent upon the permanence of the place. As with regard to the leper, it is written, he shall dwell alone, outside the camp shall his dwelling be, in chapter 13 of Leviticus. His impurity is his permanent dwelling place. His impurity is in his permanent dwelling place. Here, with regard to the obligation to distance oneself from something repulsive, the Torah stated the principle, and your camp shall be holy. In Deuteronomy 25. And there is no holiness under these circumstances. Amar Papa, Pi Chazir Katsoa Overet Dame. Pshita, Lo Tzricha, Afal Gab Desalek Minahara. On this topic, Rav Papa said the mouth of a pig is equated to passing feces. The Gemara asks, this is obvious. The Gemara replies, no, the halacha is only necessary to teach us, even though a pig emerged from the river, and one might assume that his mouth had thereby been cleansed by the river, it never becomes completely clean. The mouth of a pig is always a source of impurity. Amar Rav Yehuda, Safek Tzoa Asura, Safek Meroglayim Mutarim, Ikada Amre, Amar Rav Yehuda, Safek Tzoa B'bayad Muteret, B'ashpa Asura, Safek Meroglayim Afilu B'ashpa Nami Mutarim. Rabbi Yehuda said if there is an uncertainty as to the presence of feces, for example, whether something is or is not feces, not sure what it is, and therefore whether one is permitted to utter sacred matters in its presence, therefore whether or not one is permitted to utter sacred matters in its presence, it is prohibited to do so. However, because on the very uncertainty, we go with the stricture and say don't do it. However, if there is uncertainty as to the presence of urine, in other words, you're not sure if it's feces, then you don't say anything holy around, even if you're not sure. If you're not sure if it's urine, it is permitted to do so. Some say an alternative version of this. Rav Yehuda said, if there is uncertainty as to the presence of feces in the home, one may assume that there is no feces present, and it is permitted to speak sacred matters. But if there is a doubt as to the presence of feces in the dung heap, it is forbidden to say sacred matters by it. If there is uncertainty as to the presence of urine, however, even in the dung heap, he is permitted to do so. Savar la kahayda Rav Hamnuna, the Rav Hamnuna lo asra Torah ela keneged amud bilvad. He holds in accordance with that the position of Rav Hamnuna, as Rav Hamnuna said, the Torah prohibited the utterance of sacred matters only opposite the stream of urine. Vichi de Rabbi Yonatan Rame, Ketiv v'yad tiye lecha michutz lamachane v'yatzat shama chutz, v'ketiv v'yated tiye al lecha v'gomer, v'kisita et tze'etech, and in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yonatan, as Rabbi Yonatan raised a contradiction between two verses. On the one hand, it is written, "You shall have a place outside your camp, and there you will go." That's why, as I mentioned earlier, in the old city of Jerusalem, when the temple was standing, that was the camp of the children of Israel. It turned into Jerusalem. And outside the walls was like going outside of the camp. So they had to go outside the walls to do number 2. So the Deuteronomy 23 says, "You shall also have a place outside the camp to which you will go," meaning that one must exit the camp before attending to his bodily needs, but there is no obligation to cover it. And it is written in another verse, "And you shall have a spade among your weapons, and when you ease yourself outside, you shall dig with it, and you shall turn back and cover your excrement," in Deuteronomy 23, indicating a clear obligation that one's excrement must be concealed. Ha-ketzad, kan b'gedolim, kan b'ktanim. He resolves the contradiction. How is this resolved? Here, when one is required to conceal his bodily needs, it is referring to feces. Here, when there is no requirement to conceal his bodily needs, it's referring to urine. Alma ktanim lo asrat Torah ele keneged amud bilvad. Han neful ara share. Consequently, with regard to urine, reciting Shema was only prohibited by Torah law opposite the stream of urine. But once it had fallen to the ground, it is permitted. V'Rabanan hu digziru bahu v'chi gzaru bahu Rabanan b'vada'an aval bisfekan lo gazur. And the sages are those who issued a decree with regard to urine. And when they issued a decree, it was only in the case of their certain presence. But in case of their uncertain presence, they did not issue a decree. V'vada'an ad kama, amar Rav Yehuda amar Shmuel, kol zman shematpichin. The Gemara is asked, in the case of the certain presence of urine, until when and in what state does the presence preclude one from uttering sacred matters? Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, as long as it is wet enough to moisten the hands of one touching it. Kol zman shematpichin. V'chein amar Rabba bar Bachana, amar Rabbi Yochanan, kol zman shematpichin. Similarly, Rabba bar Bachana said in the name of Yochanan, as long as it wets the hands. V'chein amar Ula, kol zman shematpichin. Geneva mishmei derav amar kol zman sherishuman nikar. So too, Rabba bar Bachana said, as long as it moistens, and too, Ula said, as long as it moistens. Geneva, in the name of Rav, said, it is forbidden as long as its mark is apparent on the ground. Now, who is this Geneva? It's interesting that it's not Geneva, which means theft, it's Geneva. But still, it's a very interesting name. Geneva was a member of the first and second generations of Amoraim in Babylonia. Geneva was one of the more colorful characters of the era. A sage of great stature, he was often visited in his home by the Amora Rav, in whose name he cites many of his Torah statements. The second generation of Amoraim treated his teachings with respect. While Geneva was a wealthy and powerful man, at the same time he was quarrelsome and contentious. Though the details of the incident are unclear, it is known that he had a serious dispute with the Exilarch, the leader of the Jewish community in Babylonia. Geneva had a big dispute with the Exilarch at that time, named Mar Ukva, and it was only by virtue of Mar Ukva's moderation and judiciousness that the affair did not come before the Persian authorities. Ultimately, Geneva was charged with another offense, perhaps plotting against the crown, and was sentenced to death by the authorities. The sages of the following, meaning the third generation of Amoraim, cite his teachings, always appreciating his Torah while disapproving of his conduct. That's Geneva. The Gemara continues. Rav Yosef said, Amar Rav Yosef, Share le mare de Geneva, hashta tzoa, Amar Rav Yehuda Marav, kevan shekarmu panea mutar, meraglayim mibayad. Rav Yosef said, may God, his master, forgive Geneva. as Rav could not have said such a thing. As Rav could have no such thing. As Rav could have said no such thing. Now, in the case of feces, Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, once the surface of it has dried sufficiently so as to form a crust, one is permitted to utter sacred matters opposite it. It is necessary to say that the opposite, so if that's true, is it even necessary to say that the opposite, urine, is permitted once it dries? Obviously, urine would be permitted once it dries. Amar le'Abaye, my chazit de maschat aha, smochaha. Abaye said, what did you see that led you to rely on that halakha? The samchat aha is to rely on that. Rely on this halakha. Smochaha, rely on this other one. Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, Soa afilu kecheres asura. Rabba bar Rav Huna said that Rav said, uttering sacred matters opposite feces, even if it is dry as clay, dry as earthenware, it is prohibited. Vehechi damit soa kecheres. Amar Rabba bar Bachana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kol zman shezorkin ve'ena nifrechet. Ve'ikad amre kol zman shegolala ve'ena nifrechet. The Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of feces like earthenware? Rabbi Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said, as long as one throws it and does not crumble, it is still considered moist. And some say, as long as one can roll it from place to place and it does not crumble. I suppose kicking it with your foot a little bit. Amar Ravina hava ka'amena kamed Rav Yehuda midifti. Chazit soa amar leili ayen I karmu panea ilo ikad amre hachi amar le ayen I miflai afluye. Ravina said, I was standing before Rav Yehuda of Difti when he saw feces. He said to me, examine it and see whether or not its surface had dried sufficiently so as to form a crust. Some say that he had said to him as follows, examine it and see if it is cracked. I miflai afluye, that it has formed, that it's cracked. Miflai afluye, cracked, and then it is considered dry. My Havele, since several opinions were expressed on the subject, the Gemara asks, what halacha conclusions have we reached about the case of praying or saying Shema in the presence of feces or urine? Amemar amar asura, marzutra amar muteret. Regarding sacred matters, opposite feces dry as earthenware, Amemar said is prohibited, and Marzutra said it's permitted. Soa kecheres asura, Hilchata, this is the law. Soa kecheres asura, umer reglaim kolzman she matpichin. Praying or doing any sacred matter opposite feces, even if it is as dry as earthenware, is prohibited. And opposite urine is prohibited as long as it moistens. Meisive me reglaim kolzman she matpichin asurin nivlu o yavshu mutarin. My love nivlu dumya de yavshu. Ma yavshu de en rishuma nikar af nivlu de en rishuma nikar. Ha rishuma nikar asur afagav de en matpichin. The Gemara raises an objection based on what was taught in a Braita. Urine, as long as it moistens, is prohibited. If it was absorbed into the ground or dried in a place, it is permitted. What is urine that was absorbed? What is what? Urine, what did you say? Urine that was absorbed is not similar to urine that is dried. Urine that is absorbed is not similar to urine that is dried. Just as when it dries, its mark is no longer apparent, so too when it is absorbed, its mark is no longer apparent, and then it is permissible. But when its mark is apparent, it is prohibited, even though it no longer moistens. Ulatamech emeresh, kol zman shematpichin hu de asor. Ha rishmanikar share, elemeha leka lemishma mina. The Gemara raises a difficulty to counter this, and according to your reasoning, say the first clause, as long as it moistens, it is prohibited. from which one can infer, but if it does not moisten, but his mark is apparent, it is permitted. Rather, no inference beyond its basic meaning can be deduced from this Braita, as the inferences are contradictory. Lema Ketanai. Kli shenishpechu mimenu meraglayim asor likror kriyat shema kenegdo. Umeraglayim atzman shenishpechu nivleu mutar lo nivleu asor. Rabbi Yossi Omer kol zman shematpichin. The Gemara notes, let us say that this is parallel to a dispute between two Tanaim. As it was taught in the Braita, it is forbidden to recite Shema opposite a vessel from which urine was poured. However, the urine itself that was poured, if it was absorbed, it is permitted. If it was not absorbed, it is prohibited. Rabbi Yossi disagrees and said it is prohibited as long as it moistens. My nivlu, my lo nivlu, the Kamar, Tanakama. The Gemara clarifies this dispute. What is the meaning of absorbed and not absorbed in what the first Tana says? Ilema niflu de'en matpichin, lo niflu de matpichin. Va'ata Rabbi Yossi lememar kol zman shematpichin hu da'asor. Ha-rishma nikah share. Hainu Tanakama. If you say that absorbed means that it does not moisten and does not absorbed, and not absorbed means that it does moisten, and Rabbi Yossi came to say as long as it moistens, it is prohibited, but if there is no moisture but its mark is apparent, it is permitted. If so, that is identical to the opinion of the first Tana, and there's no dispute whatsoever. Ela nivla'u de'en rishuma nikar, lo nivla'u de rishuma nikar. Rather, absorbed means that its mark is not apparent, and not absorbed means that its mark is apparent. Va'ata Rabbi Yossi lememar kol zman shematpichin hu da'asur ha rishuma nikar share. And Rabbi Yossi came to say, as long as it moistens, it is prohibited, but if there is no moisture but its mark is apparent, it is permitted. In which case the dispute in our Gemara is parallel to the Tanaitic dispute. Lo. Kuli alma kol zman shematpichin hu da'asur ha rishuma nikar share. The Gemara states that this is not necessarily parallel. No, everywhere, everyone, both Tanaim agree, both Tanaim are in perfect agreement that as long as it moistens, it is prohibited, and if there is no moisture but its mark is apparent, it is permitted. On Amud Bet, on the next page, we turn the page and we read, V'hacha b'tofeach al menat latpiach ika benayu. And here the difference between them, it is the case where it's moist enough to moisten other things. According to the first Tana, the prohibition is only in effect when the urine is moist enough to moisten other objects. While according to Rabbi Yossi, it applies as long as the urine itself is moist, even if it is not moist enough to moisten other objects. Yarad litvol im yachol la'alot. We learned in the Mishnah, in a Mishnah, that one who descends to immerse himself due to a seminal emission must calculate whether or not he is able to ascend. Yarad litvol im yachol la'alot. Don't go into a mikveh unless you know you can get out of it. Oh no, that's not what it means at all. We learned in the Mishnah, one who descends to immerse, of course if you get into a mikveh you should make sure it's something you can get out of physically. We're talking about something else. We're talking about this. Yorad litzvol, imichol alot v'chulei, lema tana stama k'Rabbi Eliezer, damar ad hanetzachama. We learn in the Mishnah, one who descends to immerse himself due to a seminal emission must calculate whether or not he is able to ascend, cover himself with the garments, and recite the morning Shema before sunrise. The Gemara asks, let us say that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi taught this in the unattributed Mishnah in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who said one may recite Shema until sunrise. The Gemara immediately rejects this assumption. Afilu tema Rabbi Yoshua, v'dilma kevatikin. Tamar Rabbi Yochanan, vatikin ayu gomrim ota im enetzachama. The Gemara, even if you say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua, who disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer and holds that one may recite the morning Shema until the end of the third hour of the day. And perhaps the halacha in the Mishnah was directed towards those whose practice was in accordance with the custom of the Vatikin, pious individuals who were scrupulous in the performance of mitzvot, with regard to whom Rabbi Yochanan said the Vatikin would conclude the recitation of Shema with sunrise. Now, what is this Vatican? The Vatican is, I believe, a part of Rome. But the Vatikin, the origins of this word, often used by the sages, is unknown, and its meaning is unclear. Some say that the word is of Semitic origin, while others maintain that it is from Greek. If it is indeed from Greek, then it likely comes from the word ethikos, Vatikin etikos, meaning ethics, in the sense of God-fearing. Some argue that it comes from the Arabic wathik, the Arabic wathik, Vatikin, wathik. Wathik means strong or brave, or alternatively hidden, in which case Vatikin would mean modest people. Based on the translation of the word in the book of Ben Sira, apparently the word means wise or experienced. So the Vatikin, in any event, were very careful to finish the Shema by the moment of sunrise, the Netzach Hama. The Mishnah said, if he doesn't have time to get up and get dressed and say Shema, he should cover himself with water and say Shema. So they question this. If he gets into the water and says Shema, underwater perhaps, then his heart will see his privates. There's no separation between his heart and his waist and what is below. If one calculates that he will not be able to ascend and cover himself with the garment times of Shema, he should cover himself with water, but then his heart's going to see his nakedness. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Itema Rabbi Acha bar Abba bar Acha mishum Rabbeinu, Mayim achurin shanu, Dedamu ka'ara sumicha, Shelo yireh libo ervato. Some say, regarding this, Rabbi Elazar said, and some say it was Rabbi Acha bar Abba bar Acha in the name of Rabbeinu, meaning Rav, said that it was taught with regard to murky water, which is considered like solid earth. So let's say he's immersing himself in murky water. It's considered like solid earth, therefore it constitutes a barrier so his heart does not see his nakedness. I don't know if I'd want to immerse myself in murky water. I don't know. In our generation, we're all istinus. We're all dainty and finicky, compared to, they used to be more tougher then. They could toivel in a mud mikveh. I don't know. Murky water mikveh. Tanu Rabbana Mayim Tzulim Yesheb Be'em Ad Savaro V'Korei V'Yeshomim Ochran B'Raglo. The sages taught in the Braita, if one was in clear water, he should sit up in it to his neck and recite the Shema. Then there's a separation between his head and the rest of his body. And some say he sullies the water with his foot. If there's there's mud on the floor of the spring or mikveh, he kicks up the mud. Okay. Tanakama, Hare liba royat erva, kasavar liba royat erva mutar. Hare akevor royat erva, kasavar akevor royat erva mutar. The Gemara asks, and in accordance with the first Tana, doesn't his heart see his nakedness through the clear water? The Gemara replies, he holds that even if his heart sees his nakedness, it is permitted to recite Shema. The Gemara continues and asks, but the clear water, doesn't his heel see his nakedness? What about his heel? His heel's going to see his privates. The Gemara replies, here too, the first Tana holds that in a case where his heel sees his nakedness, it's permitted. Itmar akevor ro'at erva, mutar nogea. Nogea, Abaya amar asor, Rava amar mutar. The Gemara notes, it was stated if one's heel sees his nakedness, it's permitted. However, what is the halacha in a case where his heel touches his nakedness? He's crouched down and his heel touches his privates? In such a circumstance, can a person say the Shema? Abaye says it's forbidden, and Rava says it's permitted. Rav Zvid matne le lahash marta hachi. Rav Zvid taught the whole subject in this way. Rav Chinana bereid Rav Ika matne le hachi. And Rav Chinana taught it in a different way. Nogea divrei kol asur. Ro'eh Abaye amar asur, Rava amar mutar. Lo nitna Torah l'malachei sharetz. V'hilchata nogea asur ro'eh mutar. So, Rav Chinana taught it this way. In a case where his heel touches his nakedness, everyone agrees it's prohibited. Their dispute was with regard to a case where his heel sees his privates. Is in close proximity. Or even just, if a person, what is this seeing? If a person is standing naked, the sages say his heart sees his privates. His heel sees his privates. It's an interesting language, and it's the subject of a deeper and more philosophical understanding of the Torah, which I can't get into now. What is the heart seeing? Sounds like poetry, doesn't it? The heart sees. So Abaye said it's prohibited, Rava says it's permitted. Rava said the Torah is not given to ministering angels. The Torah is given to men. And men are inherently flawed and cannot be perfect. A person who is opposed to a ministering angel, a person who, as opposed to a ministering angel, has genitals and cannot avoid this. And the halacha is that if his heel touches his nakedness, it is prohibited, but if it merely sees his nakedness, it is permitted. Amar Rava, Tsoa b'sheshit, mutar likror kriyat shema kenegda. Erva b'sheshit asur likror kriyat shema kenegda. Tsoa b'sheshit mutar likror kriyat shema kenegda. Tsoa d'chisuye talya milta. Vaha mikasya. Erva b'sheshit asur likror kriyat shema kenegda. V'lo yireh v'cha ervat davar amar rachamana. Vaha ka mitchazya. Rava said opposite feces covered only by a lantern-like covering which is transparent, it is permitted to recite Shema. In other words, if there is some feces under a bell jar, you can see it, you can't smell it, it is permitted to recite the Shema according to Rava. But opposite nakedness covered by a lantern-like covering, an ashashit, in other words, through a window. They didn't have windows back then, they didn't have glass windows. But they had lanterns made of glass. So if you looked through the lantern and you could see somebody who was naked, but you could not see the actual person who was naked, that's called derech ashashit, ba'ashashit. Opposite feces in a lantern is permitted to recite Shema, because with regard to feces, the ability to recite Shema is contingent upon covering, and even if it's a clear, transparent covering. As it is said, and cover up your excrement, in Deuteronomy 23. And although it is visible, it is covered. On the other hand, opposite nakedness, covered only by a lantern-like covering, it is prohibited to recite Shema. The Torah, and of this the Torah says, and no indecent thing shall be seen in you. Lo yireh v'cha ervat davar. Deuteronomy 23. And here, it is actually seen. You could see through the glass and see a naked person. So then it's forbidden. Amar Abaye Tsoa shel kol shehu mavatla barok. Amar Rabba barok ave. Amar Rabba Tsoa beguma. Maniach sandalo aleh v'koreh kriyat shema. Ba'amar brei de ravina Tsoa de devuka v'sandalo mai teku. Abaye said a small amount of feces may be nullified with spittle, as long as it is covered. It is permitted to recite the Shema. So there's a little bit of feces in the place of prayer. It's not good. Ideally it should be cleaned and taken away. If there's simply not time for that, one's already about to stand for the prayer, for whatever reason, all he has to do is spit on it. the spit will cover it. Rava said this applies only when it's thick spittle. Rava said feces in a hole in the ground, he places his sandal over the hole to cover it and recites the Shema. Mar, son of Ravina, raised a dilemma. What is the halacha in a case where feces is stuck to his sandal? Perhaps he would be considered filthy in that case. Let this dilemma stand and be resolved. That's called teku. It's an unresolved dilemma. So we have a few minutes left. We'll continue here on Daf Bet. Amar Rav Yehuda, Goy Arom, Asor Likra Kriya Shmo Kenegdo. My area, Goy, Afil Yisrael Nami. Yisrael Pshita Led Asor, Ela Goy Itz Terichale. Ma Udetema, Huel Katibahu, Asher Basar Chamorim Basaram, Ema Kachamor Ba'almahu. Kamash Malan de Inhu Nami Ikru Erva, Diktiv Vervat Avihem Lo Ra'u. Rav Yehuda said, opposite a naked Gentile, it is forbidden to recite Shema. The Gemara asks, why did the Gemara discuss particularly the case of a Gentile? Even with regarding to a Jew, it is also prohibited. The Gemara replies, opposite the nakedness of a Jew, it is obvious that it is prohibited. However, opposite the nakedness of a Gentile, it was necessary. Lest you say that since it is written about the Gentiles in the book of Ezekiel, their flesh is the flesh of donkeys, say that his nakedness is like that of a mere donkey and does not consider nakedness. So it's the kind of attitude that one might say, oh, there's Jews and then there's the rest of the world has a separate status. Like there's the Gemara taught us that their nakedness is also considered nakedness. They are also human beings. It is written regarding the sons of Noah. So the Gemara says, no, you cannot, just because there's this verse in Ezekiel, you cannot take a non-Jew out of the class of a human being. He's a human being like you, and you cannot, you have to be careful of not standing in front of his nakedness and not say, it's like a donkey. No, it's not a donkey, it's a human being. It's written regarding the sons of Noah, the fathers of all human beings in the world, and their father's nakedness they did not see. Although Noah predated Abraham and was consequently not Jewish, his nakedness is mentioned and his nakedness is considered nakedness. V'lo yitkaseh lo b'mayim harayim v'lo b'mei hamishra ad sheyatil l'tochan mayim. V'kama maya ramei v'azel elahachi kamar. Lo yitkaseh lo b'mayim harayim v'lo b'mei hamishra klal. And we learned in the Mishnah, and one who needs to recite Shema may not cover himself with either foul water or water in which flax was soaked until he pours other water onto it. If you soak flax in water, the water smells horrible. The Gemara asks, how much water does he need continue to pour in order to render them a permissible covering? If he is covering himself with water in which flax was soaked, it must be a considerable amount of water, requiring at least an equally considerable amount of water to neutralize it. Rather, this is what it says. He may neither cover himself with foul water, nor water in which flax was soaked at all, and urine, which is considered repugnant, until he adds clean water to it, and only then he may recite Shema. Tanu Rabbanan kama yatil letochan mayim kol shehu. Rabbi Zakkai Omer Revi'it. The sages taught a related disagreement in the Braita. How much water must one add in order to nullify urine? Any quantity is sufficient. Rabbi Zakkai said one must add a quarter of a log. And the halacha is in accordance with Rabbi Zakkai. Amar Rav Nachman machloket levasof aval batchila kol shehem. Rav Nachman said the dispute is with regard to the case where the urine is already in a vessel, and afterwards one seeks to nullify it. You used to have chamber pots back then. They didn't have flush toilets. However, if clean water was in the vessel at the beginning, before the urine, each drop of urine is nullified as it enters into the vessel, and therefore any amount of clean water is sufficient. So there's a difference between if there's urine on the floor, in which case it needs a revius of water, and a urine in a vessel where any amount of the water will nullify it. But Rav Yosef Amar Machloket lechatchila aval levasof divrei kol revi'it. Amar le Rav Yosef Mishmei va'aiti le revi'ita demaya k'Rabbi Zakkai. Rav Yosef said, this dispute is with regard to the amount of water necessary to have the vessel at the beginning, before the urine. However, afterward, everyone agrees that a quarter of a log is required. The Gemara relates, Rav Yosef said to his servant at the beginning, bring me a quarter of a log of water in accordance to the opinion of Rabbi Zakkai. It's getting late. I don't think we're going to finish this daf today. Let's just read one more passage. Tanu Rabbanan, Graf shel Re'iv, Avit shel Meraglayim, Asor likrot Kriyat Shema kenegdam. Afal pi she'en behem klum, u'meraglayim atzman, ad she'yatil letochan mayim. V'kama yatil letochan mayim? Kol shehu. Rabbi Zakkai omer, Revis, ben lifnei hamita, ben lachar hamita. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, lachar hamita. Koren, lifnei hamita, eno koren. Aval marchik hu arba amot v'koreh. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer, afilu bayet mea ama, lo yikra ad sheyotzi'em, o sheyanichem tachat hamita. The sages taught an elaboration of this point in the Tosefta. Opposite a chamber pot used for excrement or urine, it is prohibited to recite the Shema, even if there is nothing in it, as it is always considered filthy. Opposite urine itself, one may not recite the Shema until he pours water into it. And how much water must he pour into it? Any quantity. Rabbi Zakkai said a quarter of a log, about 86 cc's, or perhaps 150 cc's. That is the ruling of both when it is before the bed and both when it is behind the bed. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, what is behind the bed? When it is behind the bed, one may recite Shema. But when it is before the bed, one may not recite Shema, but one must distance himself 4 cubits and then recite the Shema. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is even more strict, saying, even in a house 100 cubits in size, one may not recite Shema until he removes it or places it beneath the bed. And here we'll say Shabbat Shalom. This is the Daf Yomi for August 26th on Shabbat. And I hope may you all be well, and tune in next week for more Daf Yomi in Berakhot.